welcome everybody to our very first speaker for our planned series this winter, so thank you so much for coming. Tonight, the John H. and Frances Lane Bias Foundation is collaborating with the town of Duck to offer educational programming for the public. Tonight's presentation is generously sponsored by the Bias Foundation. Their funds are donated for reception, speaker gifts, and travel costs if required. So stay tuned for announcements after tonight about our January presentation, which will be about shipwreck science on the coast of North Carolina. And we will send out that date and time soon. And just a little bit of housekeeping. We have coffee and water and snacks and wine in the back corner over here. And if you need restrooms, they're right out these doors and down the deck right there. So to introduce our speaker tonight, I want to bring up Mr. Mark Leahy.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome tonight to our first lecture series. It should be a very interesting evening. History is usually shrouded in the fog of the unfamiliar. The events are usually too distant, the people and the places too far away to really relate to in today's world. But tonight, history will really come alive for us. Tonight's presentation really sheds light on our community, how it was established, and the place that we love, and a name that we absolutely know in the Bias family. So it should be an interesting evening. Our distinguished speaker earned his PhD in history at the University of Minnesota and has been on the faculty of Elizabeth City State University since 1999. He is currently the director of the international programs and was formerly the chair of the History and Political Science Department. He is also an author. His latest book was published in 2015, is a history of Elizabeth State City College. Elizabeth City State University, excuse me, and he has graciously donated the proceeds from that book to programs that support the university and the students, and so that shows you just a little bit of the character of the man we're about to see tonight. He has also lectured extensively in the community on African American history and on Elizabeth City and its relationship to our region and its development. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to introduce the Professor of History and the Director of International Programs at Elizabeth City State University, Dr. Glen Bowman.
Hey, thank you, Mark. I appreciate that really nice introduction. I'm going to use that, yeah. I wanted to use that too. Thank you. Thank you, Christian. Yeah, I am from Elizabeth City, and I want to let you know that ECSU is doing extremely well. I know we have some Viking supporters here. I'm wearing my Viking colors tonight. As you can see here, the Viking blue on the screen. But if you follow the news, we had a couple rough years in the back, but I think the Viking ship is back on track. We've avoided shipwrecks, and I see nothing, hopefully, but clear sailing from here on out. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm overwhelmed with the support. I did not anticipate such a large crowd on a Friday night, of all things. Usually people are hanging out at restaurants on Friday night and trying to relax at home after a long week, but you're coming out tonight to learn about some history. So I'd like to thank you for your support tonight, and I hope the rest of the series has such great attendance as tonight. My topic tonight is John Henry Bias, Financial Success in a Time of Great Prejudice and Depression. This might be a strange title. Great Prejudice and Depression. That's kind of a strange way to put it, but I chose this for a specific reason. Okay, how easy is it to make a fortune in America in 2018? A lot of people want to do it. It's not easy to do. Now, think about how hard it was to gain financial success, let's say about 90 years ago, going up against the twin pressures, the twin challenges of prejudice plus the Great Depression. And there were some who succeeded despite that. And one of those individuals was John Henry Bias, as you'll see tonight. Again, my goal is to leave you with something kind of, in some ways, completely new. Some things you might already have seen, some things you might not. I don't know how many of you know this. Let me try this. I'd rather use this. I like to walk around. There. Is this going to work? All right. The history of the Outer Banks. How many of you before have heard about the original Nag's Head Hotel? A few of you have. You might know that it was burned during the Civil War and was rebuilt in the 1870s. But how many did you know that there was actually an African-American version of that hotel? Not really well known. There actually was another boarding house of sorts for African Americans. The Raleigh Banner Enterprise has this piece back, and look at the date, 1883, the grand opening of the first African American board house on the Outer Banks. Okay, I just discovered this doing research. I wasn't even looking for it, but I found it. That's not my talk tonight, but my point I want to make here is this. In terms of the history of the Outer Banks, there's not been a whole lot of history written about African Americans. In many ways, the library of sorts has plenty of empty space. But the good news is that there is more material coming out. There are more books coming out. There is more research being done, and hopefully one day those shelves will be filled. So I'm going to share something a little bit tonight that many times has escaped the attention of others who've studied the history of the Outer Banks. John Henry Bias. John Henry Bias was the second chief executive, and technically he was the first president of what was during his lifetime called the Elizabeth City State Normal College, Normal School. This was a school that was created for one major reason, and one reason only, to train teachers, to train African American teachers to teach in the public schools of North Carolina. We didn't have any degree programs. This was not a college. This was not even in its earliest days even as much of a high school. This was a teacher training school. John Henry Bias was the first person who took power, who was designated as president. And he was the second chief executive. John Henry Bias is important historically at ECSU because it was during his presidency that we became a baccalaureate institution. In 1939, we were rechristened Elizabeth City State Teachers College. And as a result, we were able to offer Bachelor's of Science degrees. And that was because of the work of John Henry Bias. And it was because of his leadership. John Henry Bias's days at Elizabeth City go back to 1904. When the principal at the time, a man named Peter Weddick Moore, met him at the railway station, the Northern Southern Railroad in Elizabeth City. And Mr. Bias spent some years and then moved on to Shaw University and then came back to Elizabeth City back in 1921. So he is regarded as one of the founding fathers of Elizabeth City State University. And every March, we hold something called Founders Day. And it is during that day that we honor the founders, and we honor P.W. Moore, and we honor John Henry Bias, their sacrifices, their vision, their perseverance during a time of great prejudice and Great Depression. Here is the portrait that hangs in Thorpe Administration Building. This was done during the late 1930s, from my understanding, based upon this picture. Just a few pictures just so you know who I'm talking about, in addition to that one over here to my right. It's a picture of John Henry Bias with some teachers. The picture of the woman off to the right, to his left, I should say, and the picture is right, was a woman named Annie Holland. Annie Holland was somebody, if you understand history of Gatesville in Gates County, she was very instrumental in the schools in that county, in that area. In 1907, a Missouri native, he married Frances Lenora Lane, and they had 7 children. Most survived to be adults. John Calvin Bias actually was on the board of trustees of Elizabeth City State College in the 1960s. They had 7 children, and were raised on the campus. Were raised in Elizabeth City. The Bias name is still on the campus to this day. Actually, there are 2 places where you would see the Bias family on campus. There is Bias Hall, which was built in 1939 as the new women's residence hall. The other building is called Lane Hall. That was named Lane Hall after the maiden name of Francis Lane Bias. So the name is visible on campus to this day. And Lane Hall to this day holds the mathematics department of Elizabeth City State University. The point I want to make here today, though, even though the John Henry Bias name is instrumental and visible on the campus, he wasn't above all an educator. But he wasn't just an educator. Okay. And education, in my opinion, might be the highest status one can do. It's a way of giving back to the community. And John Henry Bias did that. And that's important. I don't want to downplay that at all. But he wasn't just an educator. He was an active and sometimes highly adept businessman on and off campus. Now, granted, remember, this was a time when he had to face, again, the Great Depression and also the prejudice of a world that was based on white supremacy. And despite those challenges, despite those twin headwinds, he succeeded. He succeeded. And in doing so, he made a difference in the lives of countless students and countless young people and countless others in the area. 2 things I want to talk about tonight. First, I want to just give you a little bit of a glimpse of what John Henry Bias and his associates were up against. Okay. And second of all, I want to just tell how he overcame that, and what did he accomplish despite the prejudice of the times. I want to talk briefly about the cultural prejudice, bias, if you will, and there was a clear bias against African Americans as businessmen and women. If you were a farmer and you were African American, you would have to be expected to pay higher interest rates for your crop. We know that African American farmers were exploited for their labor, sometimes had to pay interest rates as high as 37%. Could they get a bank loan? Good luck getting a bank loan. African Americans sometimes just took it in their own hands and built their own banks, including the Albemarle Bank that was built in Elizabeth City in 1921. The story of that bank, I will tell it at a future time. I'm still doing the research on that, but it's an interesting story. But there was a great deal of prejudice against African Americans, stereotypes, if you will. And sometimes these were cruel stereotypes. Just an example. In 1919, in Elizabeth City, the state representative, a man named William Oscar Saunders, who actually had operated a newspaper and was a newspaper editor in Elizabeth City, asked the governor of North Carolina, a man named Thomas Becket, to visit Elizabeth City to be part of a celebration. This was the upcoming tercentennial. Does anybody know here what a tercentennial is? You've heard of bicentennial. I remember the bicentennial. 300. That's actually very good. 300. Technically, according to the dictionary, it's relating to a period of 300 years. It's a 300th anniversary. In 1919, African Americans celebrated the 300th anniversary of the first Africans coming to the New World. Essentially, it was the 300th anniversary of African American history. By the way, that 400th anniversary is coming up next year. And we at ECSU are going to be doing something about it. We're going to be presenting, my colleagues and I will be in the area, in the region, and I've already talked to some people in Rotary, and maybe I'll be visiting, who knows, or maybe one of my colleagues will be visiting Dare County in 2019. But this was a huge anniversary in 1919. The governor was there. It was their anniversary. What did the governor say at this anniversary? Did he show them the proper respect and deference? According to him, and this is a direct quotation, okay, as a race, you have two faults. You don't make enough, and you spend too much of what you do make. Just imagine a governor of all people. I mean, governors and politicians and government spending, do we really need to have somebody like that telling other people how to spend their money? At their gathering, he said the Negro is the best spender on earth. Save some money. He told them to save some money every week. Just tell you, he's told them, this is, I mean, this is a direct quotation. If some slick salesperson comes around, sick the dog on him. If that doesn't work, then let your wife beat him with a hot skillet. And if you get in trouble for it, I'll pardon you. Okay, insulting people at their celebration after being invited. Those are the kinds of prejudices that people like John Henry Bias had to go up against. Okay. Despite that, there were other examples of outstanding African-American businessmen and women. For example, Charles C. Spaulding, who was the president of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company in Durham, North Carolina, the largest business by African-Americans in North Carolina, well, actually in the United States at its time. Sold life insurance, mostly burial insurance. People don't always know that the first self-made woman in America to become a millionaire was African-American. Sarah Breedlove was her birth name, Madam C.J. Walker. She was involved in selling beauty products. So not just the first woman self-made millionaire in the United States, but she happened to be African-American. So the reality is that some overcame the prejudice and succeeded. But they weren't alone. They weren't alone. There was somebody named John Henry Bias who would join them. Now, what can we say about John Henry Bias as a businessman? Arguably, John Henry Bias was the most renowned African-American businessman, not just in Elizabeth City, but also the Outer Banks in the 1920s and 1930s. Arguably, he was the most renowned in a fairly large region, I should say. And I'm going to discuss this briefly in three different ways. First, about what he did in Elizabeth City. Second, what he did out here in the Outer Banks. And third, what he did specifically when he was the president of what is today Elizabeth City State University, back when it was the Elizabeth City State Colored Normal School. Okay, those three things show his ability, his vision, his strength as a businessman. First, Elizabeth City. In Elizabeth City, John Henry Bias was president of the Elizabeth City Negro Business League. Now, what this business league did, this was an organization in town, and they supported African-American businesses. They would have regular meetings in which they supported each other. John Henry Bias was definitely supportive of the ideals of Booker T. Washington. Now again, not all African Americans were supportive of Washington's ideals, especially in the 1920s and 1930s. Some were more supportive of the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois argued more in terms of confrontation. He believed that African Americans should start more to demand their rights. He was impatient with the idea of accommodation. He was impatient with the idea, and rightly so, rightly so. Washington's focus was on having African Americans become adept in education and business. He believed that through success in those areas, the whites would start to respect African Americans. Now, in time, Washington's ideals became out of vogue. And frankly, it took people demanding their rights for people to take notice. I mean, that's the reality, is W.E.B. Du Bois, in the long run, his ideals were going to be the ones that were, in many ways, one of the backbones of the civil rights movement. But Washington believed, and this made a lot of sense during this time, that if you want to get attention, and if you want to get respect, then you go against the stereotypes. You save money, you work hard, you go to school, you get an education, you follow the rules, and you become contributing citizens. John Henry Bias was in many ways, the Elizabeth City equivalent of Booker T. Washington. There's a picture of Booker T. Washington, a later picture, I should say. Booker T. Washington is known today a lot of times not for his Negro Business League, but for his ability in getting white businessmen to support black schools. Has anybody heard before of the Rosenwald schools? Julius Rosenwald? Absolutely. There are some all around this area. In fact, if you go, when I head back town tonight, I will go past the Currituck Barbecue, and the owner of that actually has purchased a Rosenwald school and actually has the school building in back of the restaurant. So that, if you go by there and you see that building back there with the new roof on it, that was a Rosenwald school. Booker T. Washington was the one who convinced Julius Rosenwald to invest his money that he made through Sears and Roebuck into schools for African Americans. There's a picture of Rosenwald right there. It's very difficult to overestimate the impact of Booker T. Washington and Rosenwald, that connection. Because the reality was, during this time, very few whites were interested in paying taxes. And without some supportive help from outside, many schools would not have been built. And education would have been non-existent for African Americans in many parts of the South. It's not always well known, but we're getting the word out more. You might have heard this and read about it in the paper. The Pilot had an article about this a few months ago. One of my colleagues at ECSU, Dr. Melissa Stuckey, actually won a grant to help restore the Rosenwald School building that's on the campus. This was a school building that and still exists. You can still see the building on the campus. It was a building in which student teachers could train and teach students who were in the public schools of Elizabeth City. It was, think of it like a student teaching right on campus. And then there was a later Rosenwald School building built across the street from Moore Hall on the campus. There's a picture of it today. Actually, about a year ago, I took that picture. In any case, the Outer Banks. What did John Henry Bias and others, I should say, and others do in the Outer Banks? If you look around, and we all know this because we drive by here, we visit here, we live here. The Outer Banks, as we all know, is a major tourist area. And people come from all over the country to come vacation here. And they spend billions of dollars, I imagine, on the Outer Banks. Now, 100 years ago, that was absolutely, definitely, certainly not the case. And he goes, what happened? I mean, a lot of things have changed, but the Outer Banks, compared to what back then, it's almost completely different. And we kind of all know that because a lot of things around us are fairly newly built. A lot of times, if you look at the history that's out there, sometimes certain people get credit for making the Outer Banks a vacation destination. Sometimes Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets credit for that. Sometimes the governor during the Great Depression, an Elizabeth City native named John C.B. Ehrenhaus sometimes gets credit for that. Sometimes also credit is given to the man I mentioned earlier, the editor of the Elizabeth City Independent, a man named William Oscar Saunders. Saunders was the one who pushed to have a Wright Brothers Memorial, and we all know that exists. Saunders was the one who pushed for a bridge across Currituck Sound, and we all know that bridge was built in time. Sometimes they get credit, but not everybody who deserves some credit about the Outer Banks history does get credit. I don't want to forget, of course, the man of the hour, John Henry Bias. Now, what do we know about John Henry Bias and the Outer Banks? What do the records say? We know for a fact that Bias himself, and again, he had some associates, some partners, was an active real estate investor. And I'm just saying, briefly here, he and his partners bought more than 80 acres, actually I think 84 acres, with partners Henry Hargreaves, who was a local businessman in Elizabeth City, and also a fellow employee, a fellow worker at the State Normal School, a man named Charles Jackson Jenkins. Over 80 acres in Duck. 80 acres, and I mean from ocean to sound. Okay. Ocean, 80 acres. Now you wonder,
and you look at real estate prices today, and you wonder, what would that be worth today? 80 acres. Well, first thing, 80 acres, I don't even want to put a number on it because it'd be a number that might, just might be hard to figure, hard to put into, I don't know how many millions it must be. Okay. What did he and his partners pay for it? A little over $2,000. A little over $2,000, about $2,100. Now, again, if I just said 80 acres, how big is an acre? Because you hear someone has like an acre of land. Is that a lot of land? Well, let's do the math here. An acre is about 208 feet by 208 feet. Right, that's not a small piece of land. If you have to mow that lawn in the summer, you're going to be sweaty by the end of the time you're mowing the lawn. But 84 acres is over 3.6 million square feet. And I'm not talking about property that's out, in the farm or in the sticks or rocks and everything. We're talking about oceanfront, sound-front property. Okay, it's amazing. How big is 84 acres? Think of how many Americans are out there. Some of them are right now eating pizza, maybe at Pizzazz Pizza or maybe elsewhere. Think of all the Americans, the 300 and some million Americans who ate pizza today. Okay. How much pizza do Americans eat today? Okay. From my able to find out my own research, just to figure out, it's a little bit less than 100 acres of pizza. Okay, so 84 acres. So think of it, the amount of land that was bought by John Henry Bias and his partners was just a little bit less than if you took all the pizza that is eaten in the United States of America, including Alaska and Hawaii. Okay, and I know kids eat a lot of pizza. Okay, and a lot of people do because it tastes good. Just imagine, that is a lot of land. Okay, I think now, well, gee, if I could have bought 84 acres for $2,100, gee, that's a steal of a lifetime. Why didn't everybody else buy it? Well, that's a good question. At this time, was this seen as a shrewd deal? You think today it would be the obvious no-brainer of a lifetime. Sure, I'll pay that kind of money. Sure, just give me my checkbook. It seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? But see, sometimes things are clearer today than they were back then. And it takes vision to see what others don't see. Okay? Sure, it would have been nice to buy Amazon.com back in 1998, or Google in 2006. Sure, but how many did and how many have held on? How many people, thinking back, this land was for sale. Anybody could have bought it. It was not seen as a shrewd deal. According to the September 6, 1929 Elizabeth City Independent newspaper, there's a story about the closure of a local office at Kitty Hawk because they couldn't sell them. It was a futile effort. That's a direct quotation from the newspaper article. In 1929, a real estate office gave up because they couldn't sell this land. A lot of people didn't see a lot of value in oceanfront or soundfront property. What can you grow on sand? You can't grow corn. You can't grow cotton. You can't grow tobacco on sand. Some people thought, what a waste of money. You can't grow anything on there. They didn't see the vision of vacation. They didn't see the vision of transportation. They didn't see the vision of electrification. They just didn't see it. A futile effort, indeed. I don't think it was a futile effort to John Henry Bias and his colleagues. Now again, I don't want to just talk about John Henry Bias. He had partners as well, and they did this together. One of the partners was Henry Hargreaves. Now who was Henry Hargreaves? Henry Hargreaves was an Elizabeth City businessman. He owned a barbershop, and among other businesses, he owned a pool hall and a nightclub on what is today Airing House. If you visit Elizabeth City, you will learn that many businesses are located on Airing House. Airing House named after the governor of North Carolina between 1933 and 1937. On Airing House, Cab Calloway was among many other entertainers who visited Elizabeth City and performed in Hargreaves nightclub. And during the Great Depression, when it was very, very hard to find a job for anybody and doubly hard for an African American to find a job. Many times people spend their days at the Hargreaves nightclub trying to find work, trying to find a way to make a living. When we know that Hargreaves took his property and he established a beach for African Americans on the Outer Banks. He hired workers from Elizabeth City and he would drive them out here and they would work on this club. So he did what he did with his property, and his barbershop, believe it or not, is still there. Hargreaves Barbershop is still located right off of Aaron House on Speed Street. The house was built around 1922. If you asked by the late architectural historian Thomas Butchko, who was one of my friends, a friend of the family, I should say, passed away a few years ago. He referred to Hargreaves' home in Elizabeth City as a fine example of the popular American four-square style house. And you can still see it because it's still there. So Hargreaves made a good living off of his businesses. Now, another partner was Charles Jackson Jenkins. What do we know about Charles Jackson Jenkins? There's a picture off to the right of the screen here. Thomas Jenkins building on campus today is where the police department is located. We know that Jenkins came to Elizabeth City in 1921, and he was a rarity of that time. He was a fully licensed government engineer. Does anybody know the first African American who was licensed as an engineer? Very famous African American on a postage stamp 3 years ago. Have you heard of Robert Robinson Taylor? It was 2015, there was a postage stamp made. He was Booker T. Washington's second man at Tuskegee Institute. Taylor was the first government engineer, fully licensed, who was African American. Jenkins was a rarity in that he was not the first, but he was one of the few. He came to campus, and he did many things. He worked on the grounds. He worked on trying to improve the campus. We also know that he was involved in the local Cornerstone Missionary Baptist Church, and it's not always known that he also owned real estate elsewhere. He didn't just own real estate on the Outer Banks. He actually owned real estate in Hertford. Now, not Hertford County, Murfreesboro, and Ahoskie, but he owned land in the town of Hertford, which is about 15 miles from Elizabeth City on Highway 17. We know that some of the land that Jenkins owned was later bought by the state and converted onto Highway 17. So if you leave here and head towards Edenton, you will drive on land that was once owned by Charles Jackson Jenkins. So again, like John Henry Bias, a real estate investor and successful at it, the vision. But all three of these partners were successful. This is another rarity of the time. In 1923, Jenkins was appointed a deputy sheriff in Elizabeth City. Now, that was an extreme rarity. An African American actually having an official post in law enforcement in the South in 1923, well, Jenkins was respected. He was respected for many things. He was well educated, and people just trusted him, and so he was given that position. But he was only a deputy sheriff in the part of town where the school was operated. He was not deputy sheriff in the white part of town. Okay, let's not go too far on that. He was still deputy sheriff, talking about the segregated South, and that is still something. That is still something for the time. Of course, we all know this. We all know that if you look through Bias Shores, you look through Duck, North Carolina, you will see streets named after Bias and Jenkins, for sure. I did want to share with you a few pictures that have come from the ECSU archives. We don't have a lot of pictures of the real estate property that Bias and his partners owned, but we do have a few. These are from around 1933. Again, I did my best to improve the picture so it actually would kind of survive the test of time. And I assume this is on the sound side, but I don't know. To me, it looks like it would be. Just in case you ever visit Elizabeth City right now, for the next few weeks, there is an exhibit, a small exhibit at the Museum of the Albemarle that covers African-American beaches in North Carolina. There's some pictures there. So if you're in the area, you might want to stop by the museum. These pictures are there among other pictures. Okay. So Bias and his partners owned all this land in 1929. How did we get the tourists to come to the Outer Banks? Well, we did something to get people there. Anybody know what was built in 1930? The original bridge. Yeah, there's a picture of the original bridge. That's not the bridge we have today. Obviously, that would not work in July traffic and such. I've actually gone as far as, because I love coming out here to the beach, but I know enough not to come here on a Saturday at noon. You get here in the morning early, and then you go back over the bridge and you just count the miles of cars. And I think 15 miles is the most I've ever counted of cars. I wonder how long the miles would be if that bridge were the one that people use today. But this was the original bridge. It was built in 1930. By the way, the bridge that we do know have, the Currituck Sound Bridge of today, was built around 1967. And still holding strong. Still holding on strong, I guess. As W.O. Saunders predicted once this bridge was opened up. Now, this is a direct quotation from a newspaper in 1930. The development of the Dare County coast country has only just begun. Millions will be spent for hotels, clubs, cottages, and other improvements. 1930. I think he was right. I mean, that's a pretty good prediction. But at the time, it wasn't always apparent. Not every bridge is built is used, but this bridge was used, and that transformed Dare County, as we all know. Now, what did John Henry Bias do back as the president of Elizabeth City State Color Normal School? Well, Bias had an educational philosophy, and I think it was steeped in the philosophy of Booker T. Washington. This is a direct quotation from John Henry Bias, 1928. I'm in favor of a type of education that leads to complete living, which includes an education of the head, hand, and heart. He believed not just in book learning, but he believed in moral learning, and he believed in working with one's hands. We know John Henry Bias was very interested in gardening. And his gardening prowess was known in Elizabeth City. John Henry Bias, from what I've been able to find out from my work in the State Archives of North Carolina, was very popular. Everybody liked him. He was like everybody's uncle. Some people have that kind of personality that's bubbly and just friendly and always had a smile on his face. That seemed to be John Henry Bias. But he believed that education was important, and that's why he was in this area in the first place. But sometimes it's harder to find a chance to have a complete living experience. Like during the Great Depression. How bad was it in John Henry Bias's home, Elizabeth City? Like other places, the area was fraught with bank failures, high unemployment, high suicide rates, lack of government revenue. The counties were so broke, and that meant the schools were broke. The school needed the genius of John Henry Bias to survive. Needed it. How bad was it? There were some in the North Carolina General Assembly who said that we should just close down all the schools for a year because we can't afford it. No school for this coming year. Not closing school early, just shut down for a year or more. I mean, that's how bad it was. I mean, we think it's bad because you may have a recession, and I mean, this was the recession to end all recessions. We don't know what pain economically is, as he did back then. So what could John Henry Bias do to overcome the Great Depression? Well, he knew for a fact that most of his students were cash poor. They came from families of farmers. And many of these farmers were themselves sharecroppers who could barely eke a living, and sometimes would make no money after paying their landlord the money from their produce that they had farmed. It was very difficult. And many of these families sent their children to school, sent their daughters to school at the normal school so they could have a better chance for a better life. So he needed, and he knew he needed to find a way to help the school survive. So what could he do? He decided that since they're cash poor, there must be another way for them to pay their costs of their education. So he came up with an idea that they could maybe barter their way to an education. Instead of dollars and cents out of parents' checkbooks, why not potatoes and peas and other items? Think about it. Students need to eat. And believe me, we all know this, probably young people can eat a lot. So this was a way to actually help because you needed food anyway. And even though there was a campus farm that was 41 acres large, it wasn't always enough. So this was a way of doing it. So this plan was a marketing plan, and this was introduced to area high schools. And Bias asked for the names of needy but talented students from these high schools. And so this was a bona fide plan, a genius plan of marketing at a time when people didn't have the money, but yet they had the talent to succeed at the normal school. And soon before you know it, the pantry was filled with quarts of canned produce and bushels of potatoes and sweet potatoes and hundreds of pounds of meat because students were paying for their education through the food they needed to survive in the first place. Again, a brilliant plan for a difficult time. There also was, as I said, a campus farm, and students were involved on that farm. Faculty and students shared their campus. Again, there was a farm on campus. There were hogs and chickens and cows and mules, and sometimes the chickens would roost in the Rosenwald School building. They had to like chase them out the next day. You know, that's how it was back there in those days. And they succeeded. So did this program work? Did this brilliant marketing scheme work? Because really what counts is results. I mean, a lot of marketing schemes might sound good, but they really don't lead to positive results. What about Bias's plan? Did it work? This is, remember, during the Great Depression, the worst part of the Great Depression. In 1931-32, the school ended the year without a deficit. Just think about that. In the Great Depression, not only did the school survive, it ended the worst year of the Great Depression without a deficit. And not only that, though, enrollment increased during the next year. So this marketing plan clearly was working. It had a balanced budget. Again, at the very bottom of the Great Depression, the worst financial disaster in U.S. history. A disaster that dwarfs the credit crisis we had about 10 years ago, by the way. So this was a plan of action that succeeded. Oh, by the way, just a few facts about how things, we have a TV station, Channel 17. Back then it was a smokehouse. Interesting, that's, and we used to, where Bias Hall is now, before it was built in the late 30s, was actually a strawberry patch. We also know that the campus became kind of a local agricultural place. In fact, many local farmers came to campus sometimes for the Pasquotank Colored Fair. That's what it was called back then. And of course, John Henry Bias was involved in that as well. It must have been strange to see school teachers, future teachers, working on a farm. But that was what education was about, according to John Henry Bias. It was no dignity to work with your hands. Education was complete. Your head, your hands, and your heart. And he succeeded, and the school survived. To him, this labor had a higher purpose, and this is directly from John Henry Bias himself. We are trying to show how we are living by working. We are glad to say the future seems very bright indeed. And it's because of the service and business sense of John Henry Bias, supported by his family, supported by his spouse, supported by his faculty and his students, and on the real estate market in the Outer Banks, his partners. The future was very bright indeed. Very bright indeed. Okay, thank you. Okay, any questions? Yes, sir.
In the titles of the school, what would normal mean?
Okay, the normal schools taught the norms. And that was the point about education. There were certain norms. The first normal schools go back to Massachusetts, back in the 1800s, I think 1860s. But the purpose was to train teachers. Now, in Elizabeth City, even though today we are a university in which we have several graduate programs, and about 30 degree programs for the bachelor's degree. But when the school opened up in 1892, essentially, all we did was offer 4 levels above the primary. So if you look at what we today call middle school, that's kind of what this school was back when it first started. It wasn't until John Henry Bias came back to become vice principal in 1921 that we offered our first college level classes. And we started offering high school back in 1904-05. But normal schools taught the norms, and we trained teachers so they could pass their examinations and teach at sometimes 1 room, sometimes 2 room, very rarely above that early on, schoolhouses that dotted this region before the days of buses. One time when students had to walk 2-3 miles to school, each way. Not today, the bus comes right up to the street. Yeah, they've come a long way in terms of educational progress. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure how he didn't hear it, but was he born in Elizabeth?
He was born in Missouri. He went to what is called today Lincoln University. Actually, there were a few Lincoln universities. There's one in, I think, Pennsylvania. But he was born in Missouri. I think Palmyra, Missouri, if I'm not mistaken. And he was educated there and then ultimately moved to North Carolina. He moved to Elizabeth City in 1904. And then he left to go to Shaw University, where he was a science professor. And one of his colleagues was George Washington Carver. They were family friends. Carver would visit the Bias household and such, from what we know. Another question? Yes.
Did your research show were these 3 businessmen the first African Americans to own property on the land?
Well, I said the newspaper article I showed at the very start suggests that the answer was no, because there was a boarding house that was going to be opened in 1883. This was a huge deal, and again, I didn't have time to show you the details of that newspaper clipping. I just want to show to you that there's a lot of history out there that we don't know yet. But this was a huge deal. I mean, they invited major names to come to this grand opening, including Joseph Charles Price, who was the founder of what was called at the time Zion Wesley Institute. It is now called Livingstone College, and it's a fellow member of the CIAA with Elizabeth City State. It's a college out near, I think, Salisbury, North Carolina. But that was a business that was owned by African Americans in Nags Head in 1883. Now, we don't know anything more than that. I don't know, maybe there's something lost or found, something to be found in the real estate records of the time. That's the hard work of history, is actually going to the records, and you can find a lot of good stuff in there. Another question, yes?
Are the Bias and the Jenkins families still in the area? And do they still own property in Duck?
You know what, maybe I should let Mr. Cofield, you want to answer that question?
Yes.
Yes.
John Bass was my grandfather. What's now by Shores was part of the land that my grandfather owned.
Yes, but I'm assuming that, I'm assuming that it's, I said over the years, the property's been sold off and such, because it's the tourist, the tourism, and then you have the taxes from real estate. I imagine those are probably pretty onerous.
And I might add that Ocean Crest, which is the first subdivision as you enter Duck, is the land that Charles Jenkins owned.
Was the 20 acres like contiguous, or is it in separate places?
84 acres total. My understanding was, and again, I'm not a real estate expert, and I don't remember. Am I right that it was like one big chunk of land, and they just divided it up into 3, and I'm not sure. I mean, Hargreaves, did he want more of the sound side? Is that correct? I think that's the nightclub he built was on the sound side. Yeah, yeah. But they divide up into 3. You can go 84 acres divided by 3. Yeah, that works out pretty nice.
How did your grandfather end up in Missouri? No, yeah, but how did that family?
Good question, Nellie. I don't know.
Was Missouri a free state at the time? I mean, for African Americans, was that a free state prior to Civil War? Yes.
My grandmother was born in Kentucky, and shortly after, I think when she was about 3, her family moved to Kansas, and she grew up in Kansas. But my grandfather grew up in Missouri, and his father worked on the railroad.
Other questions? Yes.
Head, hands, heart. Those are 3 cards for 4-H, which was a girls' organization that I was in. Do you think they got that from the Bias family?
I don't know. I'm not, but it was part.
We used to chant that, hands, head, heart, health.
Yeah.
And so when I heard that, I was like, oh, that sounds just like 4-H.
Yeah, well, I don't know the history of 4-H, but that mentality, that approach to learning was common, and 4-H grew because of that. And it makes a lot of sense. And again, and it still does. It still does. The whole idea that people at a university or college are just interested in academics and have no practical common sense, I mean, that sometimes is a stereotype. And sometimes it's very true. Sometimes it's very true, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. Okay, other questions?
What was the actual money-making scheme that they were trying to use? I know they bought the real estate, and they set up, but the boarding house that you mentioned was not in
Nag's Head.
so it wasn't here.
No.
So how were they getting customers here, if you will, for the beach?
Steamship.
How were they making money?
Steamship. The way it worked at the time, the only way to get from Elizabeth City to the Outer Banks was through steamship. In fact, the only way to get from Elizabeth City to Norfolk was by steamship. My understanding was if a person wanted to take a trip from Elizabeth City to Norfolk, they had to basically budget 3 days. 1 day for the trip up, 1 day to be there in Norfolk, and then 1 day to come back home. The steamship was a way. And again, I don't know how successful the venture was. I just saw this as a clipping, and I wasn't even looking for it. I was just looking through some old newspapers. I'm doing a current project actually on the history of secondary education for African Americans in Elizabeth City area, which includes, of course, the early history of ECSU back when it was a normal school, but it goes into the birth of the high school in Elizabeth City. It goes until 1969. So in that research, I found that article, 1884, and it just like, I got to save this, and I just saved it on my hard drive because I was going through some digital newspapers, and I wasn't looking for it, but it just popped up. You know, that's the fun part about the job, is sometimes you find things you don't even know you're looking for, and then you're like, wow. And it happens every day. It happens every day. When I have time to research, it happens every day. Okay, any other questions tonight?
Well, how did Bias Shores happen?
How did Bias Shores happen in terms of what it is today?
Yeah.
That's not, do you know, Mr. Cofield?
The land was left to my grandfather's children, my mother being one of them, and it was left as the heirs of John Henry Bias. And best of my memory, in the early 70s, they then decided to develop the land as a subdivision. And so that was the beginning of them thinking about my mother and her siblings developing the land as a subdivision. The three of my grandfather, Henry Hargreaves, and And Jenkins bought the land in 29, and in 1930, they divided it among the three of them. So the 84 acres in 1930 was divided among the three of them.
Thank you. Yes?
How much of the $2,100 that was spent on that land, what percentage of that was of their wealth? Like, do they have an abundance beyond that, or was that like 90% of all the money that they owned? Like, do you have?
I don't have, I don't have any records of John Henry biases or any of the other financial dealings. I do know that a salary for I can tell you this, back then, and it's the same true today, if you want to make money, you don't go into education. That's true. Now, I'm not complaining. I know this might go on YouTube, so just have to accept that. It's a joke. It's a joke. It's a joke. But again, it comes down to the Booker T. Washington approach of saving money and being thrifty and being.
Would you say it was like a large percentage of what they had saved, or would you say that was just one of the many things that they invested in?
$2,100 was a lot of money back then, but it wasn't anything near what it, I mean, it was still a small grain growing up into a massive pot even back then. In terms of my understanding, I'm trying to think here, because in terms of calculating what it would be worth, you have to think about inflation and buying power, okay? $2,100 in back then, what it means today would be in the tens of thousands of dollars, but it would not be anything close to millions of dollars. It would be nothing close to that. Even with buying power. Simply enough, this was a deal of a lifetime. And why was this cheap or not? I do know that in 1927, North Carolina started to suffer from the Great Depression. Now, you always hear 1929 was the year, but states that were based in agriculture, like North Carolina, suffered the Great Depression earlier. So it already was hard. So maybe that might have depressed the price. And as I showed in an earlier slide, people weren't buying this, so they had to close the real estate office because they couldn't sell beachfront property in Nags Head. It was a futile effort. People didn't have the money, and maybe that was cheap, but it was, I would say probably in terms of today, about tens of thousands of dollars. And most presidents of an institution could afford that today. So I don't guess that it was probably extraordinarily expensive. It wasn't probably most of their net worth. But we don't have any papers of their family, and it's frankly, it's not in the biased papers of the ECSU archives, that I will say.
The family story is that my grandfather, the family story is that my grandfather scraped and really scraped to put together his portion of the funds to buy the real estate. That's the family story.
Well, I can say that the salaries during the Great Depression were cut in half all throughout campus, and that was generally the way it was. So money was tight, and I said they were never made big money. But I should say that John Henry Bias's predecessor at ECSU, back with the normal school days, P.W. Moore actually was involved in the area bank, and he did own shares. So, but I think a lot had to do with just the whole attitude of saving and scraping together. Okay, but it was a risk. Any real estate investment, even today, is risky because you don't know what the future is. Yes.
Subject of labor.
Yes.
The David Rubenstein Library at Duke University has just published on the cost of building Duke Chapel 1930 to 1932. And costs were 35 cents an hour. Labor was 20 cents an hour. And the superintendents 60 cents an hour. To give you an idea.
Which year was that?
1930 to 1932.
Yeah. Well, I do know that, yeah. Back what I said earlier about when I C.C. Spalding, who ran a life insurance company, he would collect from people 10 cents a week in premium. 10 cents a week. Okay, and that to some people was a lot of money. Yes.
You mentioned the Black Beach. They came from Black Beach.
Hargreaves had a nightclub, and it was an open. My understanding was, again, there's a lot of we don't know because we don't have the records.
My understanding was that Hargreaves did hire workers. I've heard this from people telling me back in Elizabeth City that he would hire people, bring them over here for the day, and they would work on building this dance club,
This black dance.
Yes, for them. And of course, he made money doing that too, of course. That was a business. But yeah, the reality was that there were beaches like that all over the area. And they were not desegregated. And frankly, beaches weren't desegregated until later on, obviously. But yeah, I said, if you go to the museum, there's actually an exhibit of several area beaches, complete with pictures. Okay, any other questions here? Okay, well, thank you again for inviting me. I really enjoyed this, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Thank you.